born in August 1942. 2 years, 3 months later, I come into the world. I come into an already occupied Holland. I come into a Holland where the Jewish people have already been caught in the process of being separated from the rest of the community. You're a child and you couldn't go to school anymore with Gentile children. Your parents had to leave their professions. If your dad or mom were a teacher or a policeman, policewoman, a fireman, a lawyer, a jurist, you had to leave your vocation, your profession. You could no longer serve in your profession. So you were in the process of being continually isolated from the rest of the Dutch community. And that made it possible for the Germans to separate the Jews and to them haul them out of there and send them to the murder camps. When I was born, there was a curfew in Amsterdam, which meant if you were Jewish, you could not be on the street after a certain hour, which meant that if you needed to do marketing, grocery marketing, you could only go at a certain time. And of course, it was the time later in the day when pretty much everything else was taken off the shelves. It gave people permission to behave terribly to Jewish people, and they did it because they could. So people's most sadistic impulses were played out every day. A real downfall for human civilization. So my father and these other men are beaten. The next day, I'm in the world with my mother. We go home. My father, my grandfather, my mother were home. We don't know where Pop is. He's there for a week in this school. The Germans were deathly afraid of infectious diseases. This is the way they handled it. So the day comes where all the Jewish men are told to stand up, and a German doctor and Dutch doctor pass by rows of these Jewish Dutch men, and they're asked, "Haben Sie eine Krankheit? Do you have an illness?" And someone says yes, someone says no. At the same moment, when they're in front of my father, another German is yelling, "Mach schnell, hurry up, hurry up." You have to keep in mind many things. One of the things is that the Germans created a heightened sense of terror all the time by yelling, by being gruff. That way keep people off their game for figuring out how to deal, how to cope. You were always victimized, and it was very difficult to figure out a strategy of how to escape and survive. So they're yelling, "Mach schnell, hurry up." And at that same moment, someone says, "Jawohl," in response to, "Yes, we are hurrying up." It is misunderstood as that my father has an infectious disease. So they grab him out of the line by his collar and they throw him out in the street. And that's how they dealt with infectious diseases. Luckily, my father gets to a telephone. You both understand, this is way before cell phones. And you had public phones, and some people had phones in their home. You had phones, but not like we have now. He gets to a phone, calls his place of business, a restaurant where he worked. He was a manager in a restaurant. They come with a bicycle and a big open box in the front. He's plopped in the box. He's taken to the restaurant. He eventually comes home and he sees me, the princeling. So he and my mother are caught in the emotional roller coaster of the joy of their new baby being born with all his digits and just having escaped hell and being terrified. And every day, if you were Jewish, and every city and village in Europe in this period, if you were Jewish, you didn't know from the next hour, the next day, whether you would survive. You lived with an absolute heightened state of terror. Pretty much what I know about Amsterdam is from what my parents have told me about their lives growing up, what happened during the war years. And in 1965, I went back to Holland. I lived there for a year to reacquaint myself with my surviving family. I worked there, I learned my Dutch again, and I had a wonderful, wonderful time. And I became familiar with Amsterdam and Holland then. I have memories from being a kid from after the war till 1949 when we came to America. I have those memories, but again, those are the memories of a child from the age of 3 till 7, and that's a different kind of memory than from someone who's older. Well, I have 2 memories from the war years, only 2, which is remarkable given how young I was. I remember there was bombing in the area where I was hidden on a farm, and I know nothing about that. I assume it was when the Brits started bombing German positions in Holland. I remember being rushed into a closet with a hobby horse, and those are really the only 2 memories. There are memories, of course, after the liberation when my cousin Andy came into my family as my brother, my /cousin brother Andy, And we had run away from home a few times after the war, and decades later, I've come to understand he and I were probably looking to go back to our foster families, whereas the Germans had convinced themselves, and a lot of other people, that Jewish people were not human beings. There was something like, they were a pestilence, like lice, like rats. They really believed this. Their racism was so wacko and out there. One of the interesting aspects of this period that lasts now, that has always given me great thought, is that we're taught that there are actions and there are consequences, and often those actions and consequences have something to do with each other. This was a period where, by and large, that was not so. You had a totally irrational social order. You could do the best planning and you would perish. You thought you were a average Dutch citizen who happened to be Jewish. You worked hard. You placed value in education. You taught your children work hard, go to school, succeed, be nice to people. Life is good, be a good citizen. And all of that turned upside down because the worst people in the world became the law, became the government, became the power. If each of you can imagine the worst person you've had the misfortune so far to meet, multiply that person by hundreds of thousands, that was the law, that was the ruling class. So if you were a Jewish person walking down the street and some Dutch fascist or German came over and smacked you upside the head, you could do nothing. There's no policeman you can go to, there's no court you can go to. The world was upside down. And in terms of actions and consequences, nothing made sense. Terrible things could come out of the blue and just strike you down. And if you survived, it could pretty much have been because you were very lucky. Now, I don't consider luck a divine attribute. Luck is luck. And I consider myself, and the survivors I know, the luckiest people I know. And I'm also fortunate that I had smart, courageous parents, and there were Gentile people who took a terrible risk, who hid me and hid my parents. That's also true. Well, after the war, 1945 to 1949, my parents worked. They saved money, and they were going to come to America. Why? Because we had a great aunt here, Tante Rose, and she came to Holland right after the war, after the liberation, took a look around and saw who she could help, and she did. And she told my father, you come to America, we open up restaurant. Very nice. I remember the whole family going on renting some kind of a bus and going from Amsterdam to Rotterdam, where the Holland-America line was. And we came to America August 12th, 1949. And then we come to America. We came to Hoboken, New Jersey, which was the port for the Holland-American line. Our aunt Rose is there. You couldn't come to America if you didn't have a sponsor. For all of the talk about the generosity of Americans, it's qualified. So we lived in Brooklyn Heights, and I remember my life career of my parents as very good. These are people who were Holocaust survivors. They were very traumatized, and they didn't spill their spilkes onto me or Andy in any way that I could really understand or remember or experience. Of course, the power of the unconscious drives the world. I still kept in touch with my foster family, Mr. and Mrs. de Groot of blessed memory. These were people who were very devout Protestant people. And we still had contact with the de Groot family, but at some point the de Groot family wanted me to be baptized. Now, Jews don't do a lot of baptism. And I think my parents took this as an opportunity to really have me for themselves entirely. Here I am, a 3.5-year-old kid with divided loyalties. I mean, imagine, there I am, 3 years old. I'm 3 years old in August, 2 months after the war's over, and all of a sudden, a set of people appear who are my parents. And I'm under the impression, in my little baby fugitive brain, that the de Groot family, my parents, I learned Dutch from them. They held me, they touched me, they kissed me, I loved them, I knew them as my parents. Along comes this other couple. So imagine I understood something about a new script, so I adapted. But they had my nervous breakdown, and there were problems. but my parents wanted to cut with the Dakota family. Holland had the highest loss number of Jews in Western Europe. After the war, there were between 15 and 20,000 people left. And again, I consider myself extraordinarily lucky. And also because of that, I feel really obligated to tell the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And some people have said, well, don't you find it burdensome? I said, no, not at all. I'm grateful that I still have my wits about me, that I can tell this story. And when I speak in schools, I often preface it by saying this may sound like a science fiction story to you guys because you're so much younger. But it really happened in the world that we all share. This stuff happened. And it didn't only happen to the Jewish people then.
Yeah.
In Holland, my bed was sort of set in a wall with curtains around it. And I remember what's like a plywood wall. It was a brownish shellacked wood, and I would be drawing on the wall. And the only reason I remember this because of how pissed my parents got when they found it each time. So I've been doing it for a long, long time, and I consider myself lucky to have art as a form of expression for whatever had happened with me to me. You come from a shattered world. You're bereft of tradition, and you have to make it up for yourself. And I think this is what I've done. And I've done this at a very unconscious level. I now have come to understand some of the meaning of my work. I love beautiful people, beautiful men and women, but I'm really inspired by beauty I see in the natural world. And I did stained glass for 19 years and all kinds of glasswork. And I did very spacey, heady windows that I really enjoyed. I find it's a way for me to express my gratefulness and honor for the beauty and complexity of the world that we are all in. I'm not out of it, I'm inside of it. In some ways, when I grew up, I always felt like an outsider. And being an artist sort of makes that legitimate, because to be outside gives you a certain breadth of freedom. We all bring our own BS to every situation, and that's enough already. But to then be caught up in a social situation where you're part of that as well could be deadly. And I'm able to, I have a good eye and a good ear for nonsense, including my own, starting from my own. And I love making art more than anything else. Making it for me is a visceral, sensual process. I look forward to the time of the day when I can sit down and draw. I do it early in the morning. I get up at 6. I'll do it for a few hours. At 9 o'clock, from 9 till 12 or so, I'll watch TV while I'm drawing. And I'm a happy boy. And if other people like it, I'm happy. They don't, fine. Art is not, one work of art doesn't need to be liked by everybody. Everybody brings their own story to everything they look at, everything they touch. For a long time, made it very difficult for me to have relationships. And when I came to think about it, I understood that I had a task in front of me. That people talk about people having reasons for their lives or having tasks or chores. I realized I had some serious tasks. In order to get to the point where I can enjoy my life, I had to deal with these things. And I did 19 years of psychotherapy. I had to come to understand things. And I also, when I lived in New York City, I got very involved in anti-war stuff and civil rights stuff. I had enormous rage. As a young man, enormous rage. And I played it out back then. And when I got older, I thought, I don't want to live a life where I'm angry all the time. So I realized I had to deal with my rage. Now, art, I understand for me, was a wonderful refuge because it allowed me to be safely the outsider, the person outside of the story, even though my smarter self has come to understand no one is outside of any story. We're all inside a story. We're all socially related. But it gave me a certain kind of, I think, moral center to be the outsider as an artist. And I worked very hard to be an insider again, find a community of people who I can trust, who I know will understand me, and have my loving there of people who I really care for. In terms of subject matter and art and being a survivor, most of the time I think of my art as a refuge, a place to go to when I don't want to deal with the story, the awful dark story. I go to art knowing from what I knew about my family experience that people can behave very, very badly. Human beings, myself included, can be very, very disappointing and scary. First of all, I don't believe there's such a thing as fiction. Whatever we write has happened to someone at some point is going to happen within the next 24 hours to somebody. Because all we can imagine comes from what our experiences have been, no matter how far out it is. It comes from what our experience has been, what we would like it to be. It had to recreate an exploded world, an exploded culture. I come from a culture that was exploded and destroyed. So, where is my community from which I learn how to be a human being, how to be an artist, how to be a Jewish adult man, all that stuff. And I've been able to do that. And in my art, what I see is umgepatcht, the imagery slapped together as I have had to slap my life together in pieces to have a life in my art. And it looks like a collage. In my art, I've had to put together pieces that come from different contexts, but they work. And my aesthetic journey and task has been to make them work as I've had to make my life work. So I had no ideas about Judaism except that it was a very unsafe thing to be. And then I figured, I paid so dearly so early on for my Jewish identity, which I did not claim. It was the context I was born in. So I thought, well, since I paid so dearly, let me find out what the treasures are. And there are many treasures. So listen, the people who risked their lives to save me and my parents were Gentiles. And they risked their lives. The people that saved me were Bible-reading, old Calvinist farmers. And every day they read the Bible, and I probably sat on their lap. And I have to say, well, I can't make fun of their belief because their religious voice called them out to be upstanders. So I have to honor that. So how do we defend ourselves from terrible memories coming back when we have less power and when we are weaker in body and mind? How do we cope with them? And knowing from the story I've been told from the age of 6 on about what happened to me, who I am, I've made that my emotional story. I know my story. I have no other words of wisdom. I'm just like you, like anyone else. I just have this particular story from which I try and learn. And of course, I try and learn what it means to be a human being from this story. And the only words of wisdom I can impart are having to do with this terrible matter of how do we treat the other. Because we have for so long been the other. It's also true, there are Jews who make other people the other as well, not so good. And the three things that I always say is kindness, kindness, and kindness. Be compassionate and be honest with yourself. And don't be afraid, because we're all imperfect, we're all human beings. What we say about other people, at some point, no doubt, has been our story too. We're all human beings. We're miserable, imperfect creatures filled with hope, filled with desire and hope and nuttiness.